Okay, first of all, I want to thank Jenny Dixon and Heidi Coleman from the Noguchi Museum in New York. There is incredible wealth of not only works of art in that museum, but also knowledge about all the complicated aspects of Noguchi's accomplishment, and that was key to this exhibition too. I also want to thank Natsu Oyobe for this beautiful exhibition and for inviting me to participate in this conference. I really appreciate that. I also want to thank Ruth Slavin and Pam Reister for a wonderful day yesterday with the terrific docents of the U of M Museum of Art that we had a terrific time yesterday morning working on the exhibition. I am a little bit embarrassed because my essay in the catalog came out with, unfortunately, all the 30 references vanished. So although I am a person who frequently tells my students to don't plagiarize and use Turnitin.com and cite things properly and all that, I have a little egg on my face about that now, but nonetheless, the folks in the Noguchi Museum have kindly come up with an insert that has the citations restored. What I would like to do here, following my essay in the exhibition catalog, is measure the intensity of Noguchi's early encounter with brush and ink in 3 stages. First, his prior encounters in Europe with the art of drawing that predisposed him to engage with ink drawing upon his arrival in Beijing. Second, the Beijing brush drawings themselves and their adventuresome experimental qualities, as well as the anxieties that they mediated with poetic innovation. And third, the creative reinterpretation of ink and brush aesthetics in his later sculptural work. The subtitle of this talk, From the Flight of the Dragon to the Pool of the Ink Stone, references these 2 images. On the left is the title page of a widely influential impressionistic study of Chinese and Japanese art by Lawrence Binyon, the curator of Asian art at the British Museum, who Noguchi conversed with in 1928 in London. The contents of this little book suggest the sort of presuppositions about Asian ink painting that Noguchi brought with him to Beijing 2 years after his discussions with its author. On the right, you see a photograph of Noguchi's 1968 granite sculpture titled Water Table. Here, the pool of water in the cavity carved in the table-like stone surface assumes the quality of the deep black pool of ink in an ink painter's ink stone, suzuri. This image demonstrates the sort of poetic resonance of the art of ink and brush that emerges in surprising forms in Noguchi's later sculptural work. Accounts of Noguchi's career emphasize his apprenticeship with Brancusi in 1927, but he also spent considerable time in 1927, 28, and early 1930 drawing from nude models at the Académie de la Grande Chaumière in Paris. This European experience of drawing from live nude models would have significant consequences for his work with brush and ink in Beijing. Gathering in Paris with other artists from all over the world to observe the poses and bodies of hired naked models and rendering their forms in crayon, chalk, and ink on paper was a staple of artistic practice for many generations. In 1931, the New York Times would admire Noguchi's Paris drawings, such as these, for line quality, quote, as pure as Ingres and as evocative as Picasso, while noting that they also had a much more finished quality than the, quote, notations flung on the wing like Rodin's. These Paris drawings demonstrate this more finished and anatomically precise approach, though Noguchi surely also came in contact with the style of rapid gestural figure drawing pioneered by Rodin, alluded to by the New York Times, and widely practiced by subsequent modernists. And while Noguchi's Paris drawings do not stray from the anatomical body as willfully as this Rodin drawing, his contours open up with suggestive gaps, and elements of shaded volume start to seep away from line in ways that are predictive of his more experimental Beijing drawings. Meanwhile, Noguchi's interaction with Lawrence Binyon in the British Museum engaged him to another constellation of artistic values. In 1928, Noguchi traveled to London, as he was later explained, quote, to study Oriental matters at the British Museum Library. And there I saw Lawrence Binyon, the curator of prints at the British Museum, quite often. When the 24-year-old Noguchi met the 59-year-old Binyon, he was surely aware that the latter had been a close friend of his estranged father, Yone Noguchi. Binyon and the elder Noguchi were near contemporaries, and their careers paralleled one another, for both were well-known poets as well as authorities on Asian art history. Having not seen his father since leaving Japan 11 years earlier at age 13, Isamu must have been curious to hear Binyon's reminiscences of the Japanese poet. But Isamu would also surely have been eager to hear Binyon's views about Sino-Japanese painting, the primary focus of Binyon's book, The Flight of the Dragon, which was published in 1911 as part of the Wisdom of the East series of books intended to serve as, quote, ambassadors of goodwill and an understanding between East and West. This lofty goal was also associated with Isamu's father, and further embraced by Isamu himself in his often quoted 1927 statement of intention to travel to Asia. Quote, my father, Yone Noguchi, is Japanese and has long been known as an interpreter of the East to the West through poetry. I wish to fulfill my heritage. Binyon's interpretation of Asian painting for the West stressed one of the fundamental ideals of Chinese and Japanese painting, namely the rhythmic vitality articulated at first in the 6th century by Xie Ho. Binyon explained that, quote, in order to apply the energy of the body to the utmost effect, we must discover a certain related order of movements. And when this is found and followed, a power comes into play which far surpasses in effect the application of brute strength and muscular effort. This is a spiritual rhythm passing into and acting on material things. The Flight of the Dragon, as the title of Binyon's book, was another expression of this rhythmic vitality, because in Chinese thought, he wrote, the dragon was a spirit which is able to pass out into all other existences of the world and resume its own form in man. Binyon praised the unique capacity of Asian ink painting to realize this elusive sense of spiritual rhythm. In Binyon's East-West dualistic thinking, shared by many of his contemporaries, what he called living ink was part of a view of Oriental culture defined in opposition to Occidental culture. Sung ink landscape was the classical touchstone of the art of the East, while Western art found its epitome in the nude bodies carved in stone in ancient Greece. Noguchi's brush drawing in Beijing, however, was to blur this binary by requisitioning the Asian art of ink painting to render monumental nudes. To be sure, many Asian ink painters had painted human bodies, but the bodies they rendered in ink were rarely, if ever, painted from life. Rather than sketch living models, East Asian ink painters also often constructed images of the body by combining different types of brushstrokes. This method of figurative ink painting is demonstrated, for example, by this 16th century Japanese painting of Bodhidharma in the British Museum, where Binyon may well have shown it to Noguchi in 1928. In contrast to the thick, dark, and rough strokes of the Zen patriarch's robe, his hair is rendered in softly raked gray strokes, while his eyes and mouth are delineated in sharp, thin black contours. In Beijing, Noguchi resumed the practice of drawing figures from the observation of posed models that he had mastered in Paris, but now he joined this practice to an exploration of the varied types of Sino-Japanese ink brushwork that he discovered with Binyon in London. His nude man and boy reclining demonstrates his most controlled mode of rendering bodies in a network of thin, even contour lines, while his huddled man and boy combines dark lines delineating bodies together with thick, abstract brushstrokes. Despite the relative regularity of the line in nude man and boy reclining, this is not the unvarying sort of ink line that Noguchi had drawn with pen in Paris. Rather, this is a brush line that changes in intensity, thickening and darkening slightly where it defines the man's shoulders, head, and eyes, but lightening and then temporarily disappearing around his upper arm and elbow, and becoming more delicate in defining the boy's body. This continuous flowing line manifests the kinesthetic qualities often admired by connoisseurs of gestural contour line drawings of the sort pioneered by Rodin. One senses the movement of the artist's body and how his response to the emerging brush paths on his paper during the process of brushing impacted subsequent brush outlays as much as the appearance of the models posed before him. Huddled man and boy may well have been drawn from the same models as those who posed for nude man and boy reclining, but Noguchi's addition of thick, abstract brushstrokes onto the figures in the former exemplifies the most unusual and experimental aspect of his Beijing brush drawings. As noted, East Asian ink paintings often combined radically different sorts of brushwork. And as this Amida Buddha by Chi Baishi suggests, sometimes viewers of such works may have the impression of an abruptness in the transitions from rough or dark and thick passages, typically in the contours of clothing, to light or delicate passages delineating different details of the hands and face. But Noguchi takes this disjunctiveness to greater extremes by overriding the logic of the carefully contoured figures with stormy broom-like sweeps, as though seeking to visualize some force pulsing through their bodies, something akin to Binyon's Flight of the Dragon. The juxtaposition of two markedly different brush systems in this drawing suggests an interesting parallel to the dualistic thinking already noted in the East-West rubric used to articulate the aims of Noguchi, his father, and Lawrence Binyon. In Isamu Noguchi's case, however, this East-West duality was sometimes configured as a poignant and even painful statement of his often denigrated status as the son of an Asian father and a European-American mother. According to Noguchi's own later account, he prolonged his stay in Beijing instead of proceeding as planned to Japan because he received a shocking letter in Moscow from his father in Japan telling him not to come to Japan using the name Noguchi. Thus, it is not surprising that during his months of brush drawing in Beijing, Noguchi was perceived by one who knew him well as, quote, the most lonely fellow I had ever known. Given these circumstances, the brush drawings of the man and boy pair, though rendered from local Beijing residents who Noguchi hired to pose in his studio, seemed to be the projection of his personal experience of paternal rejection. Or rather, they redressed this rejection with an almost homoerotic image of father-son harmony. In Nude Man and Boy Reclining, the man's body forms a cave-like den of safety for the boy who rests peacefully within this tender shelter. In Huddled Man and Boy, these figures come together in a circular composition of unity, and the overlay of abstract lines seems to visualize an energy that transpires between them. While Noguchi's Beijing brush drawings were generally well received in the various venues in the United States, where they were exhibited in the early 30s, critics were divided with regard to the success of his addition of the thick, expressive brushstrokes to his figures. One noted, quote, "The artist has added a broad ribbon of wash, not with any realistic intent, but as a sort of counterpoint to the central composition," while another criticized the intervention of shadings that seem indeed only dragged in. To be sure, perhaps due to emotional tension provoked by the subject matter, the abstract strokes in Huddled Man and Boy intrude on the figures with something of a disruptive force. In the case of Toddler with a String, however, Noguchi succeeds in melding the bursting energy of the child with large cursive calligraphic strokes. These wet gray ink strokes seem to diagram vectors of the child's dynamic exertions of budding strength. Much of the impression of Asianness associated with Noguchi's Beijing brush drawings may be attributed to their hanging scroll format. The hanging scroll, referred to in English texts by Binyon and others of this generation with the Japanese word kakemono, even when associated with a Chinese painting, was believed to be difficult to export from Japan. Henry Bowie wrote in 1911, "Work in kakemono form is seen to much disadvantage when exhibited in numbers strung along the walls of an American museum. They are best viewed singly in the recess of the tokonoma alcove." By defying this view and presenting his brush drawings as kakemono for public exhibition in the U.S., Noguchi asserted the Asian locus of their creation, materials, and techniques, while obscuring the Paris source of their basis in sketching live nude models. After leaving Beijing in 1930, Noguchi would never again focus so intently on brush and ink drawing based on the observation of live models. Despite the proficiency of his early drawing in Paris and in Beijing, the primary accomplishments of Noguchi's career were in the three-dimensional media of sculpture and design. Thus, the afterlife of his early, intense exploration of brush and ink painting is particularly interesting in terms of his remediation of qualities of this two-dimensional aesthetic in materials and forms remote from the world of the ink painter. Noguchi's first major post-war sculptures took the form of thin marble sheets, jigsawed into curved shapes and slotted together, a scheme suggested in part by the forms of Chinese characters. In 1946, Thomas Hess maintained that Noguchi derived his abstract chloros from a fusing of sensibility of the eponymous ancient Greek male figures with the abstract constructive forms of Chinese characters, like this work of calligraphy, which Thomas has illustrated in his article on Noguchi. Indeed, the perpendicular interlocking of curved stone shapes of Noguchi's sculpture resembles the combinational structure of a multi-stroke Sino-Japanese character. Noguchi returned to this investigation of the sculptural possibilities of ink and brush calligraphy in the late 1950s with a group of sculptures consisting of elements that resembled calligraphic brushstrokes more explicitly than his slotted stone pieces of the 1940s. Now Noguchi sliced curved planks from the soft, lightweight material of balsa wood and composed them in abstract spatial arrangements, which were later cast in bronze. For example, shodo hanging and shodo flowing, much as their titles suggest, shodo being the Japanese word for calligraphy, consist of three-dimensionalized brushstrokes that hover in space as though a calligraphic character had collapsed and its parts suspended midair before falling to the ground. Such works attempted to import the sense of balanced weight that operates in the virtual space of calligraphy on paper into sculpture where real gravity can only be held in balance by contending with the laws of physics. Aluminum would seem to be a surprising material for contemplating the Asian art of brush and ink. But this unlikely feat was accomplished in Noguchi's 1959 sculpture titled Sesshu, after the 15th century ink painter. This sculpture was part of a series of aluminum sheet works in which Noguchi sought to endow this material with poetic qualities without disguising its associations with industrial efficiency and new technologies. Noguchi's aluminum sculpture evokes one of the formats associated with Sesshu's painting, not the hanging scroll, but the accordion-like relief of the freestanding hinged panels of the folding screen, and the dull gray shine of the anodized aluminum surface suggests the gray tonalities Sesshu obtained in ink. Cuts and folds of aluminum reprise Sesshu's monochromatic ink rendering of rocky outcroppings and pine branches traversing the seams of the folding screen. Stone was the most important material of Noguchi's late sculpture, and like aluminum, this material might seem irrelevant to ink and brush painting. Nonetheless, one of the most dearly treasured tools of the East Asian ink painter was the ink stone, and reflections on the cultural and aesthetic qualities of this object were critical to one of Noguchi's most fruitful genres of abstract sculpture. Like other ink painters, in Beijing in 1930, Noguchi would have ground his ink from a dry cake on a small slab of stone with a reservoir for holding the water used to obtain different concentrations of liquid ink. Many years later, in the 1960s, Noguchi began creating sculptures as low table-like horizontal slabs of granite, carved with various protuberances and depressions suggesting landscape forms. Despite their large size, these landscape tables resemble inkstones in their black stone material as well as their horizontal relief. Indeed, the black stone surface of the 1968 water table is carved with two shallow recessed areas, and when filled with water, they resemble the dark pool of liquid ink in an inkstone reservoir, as dramatically shown in Anzai Shigeo's photograph of this sculpture. Referring to another of his table sculptures, Whetstone of 1970, Noguchi observed, quote, "A primary use of stone is to sharpen tools. Sumi ink is made by rubbing charcoal on an inkstone. Grinding it is a process in carving, as is the final polishing. A whetstone is of the highest significance. Thus, the painter's act of grinding the brick of ink against the wet slope of an inkstone becomes analogous to the sharpening of a steel blade against a whetstone, and the grinding of stone itself in making sculpture." Noguchi continued to ponder various associations with what one painter called preparing yourself spiritually through the ritual of ink making by rubbing the brick of ink in the puddle of an inkstone. Amidst the rough protruding areas and polished flat areas of a horizontal stone topography actually titled inkstone, Noguchi carved a shallow depression that closely approximates the well of an inkstone, though it can also be read as the bird's eye view of a pond in a tract of land with flat and hilly areas. Thus, the grinding of ink on the stone emerges here as analogous not only to the grinding of the stone in the making of the sculpture, but the environmental and geological processes that weather and form the terrestrial surface. Noguchi's youthful, passionate pursuit of the flight of the dragon had been focused on the native bodies that populated his lonely months in Beijing. But toward the end of his life, the flight of the dragon became the pursuit of a position between the microcosmic spaces of art making and the macrocosmic spaces feared and imagined by the mind. Thank you.